Chapter 3 Case in the Temple. To those who have fallen under a nightmare, draw the wind where they sleep and call their names slowly to bring them back. Wei Shangqing, Judiciary Records. Nightmare. Finally, at the end of the long and winding corridor was a lit room. Moving shadows were reflected on the paper window. There were people inside. After a careful inspection of her surroundings to make sure that there were no traps, Shayol placed her hand on the hilt of the sword hanging on her back and crouched down, moving quickly but lightly, cautiously approaching the room at the end of the passageway. As she got closer, the smell of burning incense hit her nose, which caused her to frown. It was an indescribable scent, like musty and damp sandalwood being burned. At first, the smell bore a resemblance to the incense commonly used in monasteries, but it invoked an inexplicably chilly and hazy feeling within her. A steady stream of chanting could be heard from within the room, as if someone was reciting some sort of scripture. Shayol had never been one to entertain ideas of higher beings or ghosts, and she knew little of Taoism. It would be difficult for her to discern the content of the scripture. Still, she had a feeling that it did not belong to any of Centralis's customs. Approaching the door, Shayol peered through the gap and was surprised to find a spacious temple inside, furnished no differently than that of any other cultivator's temple. Several believers in loose robes devoutly prostrated themselves under the guidance of a man who seemed to be presiding over the ritual. They reached their arms out as they chanted, seemingly offering their prayers. A towering idol stood at the center that almost reached the ceiling. Its features were obscured by hanging cloth banners, but its body appeared to be that of a regular cultivator. A name that she barely made out as Xuanping was engraved on the base, and suspended between the idol's hands were the very grains that Shayol had been searching for over the past month. The mysterious rice grains that appeared in both bodies of the sorcerer and Lin. The follower on the left suddenly stood up and left, returning with a vessel filled with water. The ritual master reached in and pulled out a fish with a large head and a narrow tail. When he took out a knife and stabbed it in the gills, the fish stopped moving. The rest of the men followed in suit. Killing in a temple? The pungent smell of fish, blood, and incense mixed together to form an intensely unpleasant smell that nauseated Shayol. The flesh was discarded, but various parts of the fish, such as its eyes, heart, and blood, were stored in different containers before being reverently arranged on the altar. It was only then that Shayol realized it was no ordinary fish, but a pufferfish that contained highly fatal poison. All of the parts chosen were those where the toxin was most concentrated. When the dragnet was laid over Centralis a month ago, Shayol would never have imagined that the handful of shady sorcerers and pharmacists she would catch would end up being a mysterious cult with a considerable amount of influence. The clues she received converged on this abandoned mansion outside of Jinsheng, and with time pressing, Shayol and Tang Zi decided to split up and act separately. This mission was meant to verify their intel, but now that she had discovered the location of the enemy lair, she had decided to rush back to the Bureau of Justice to report her findings and organize an operation to squash them as soon as possible. Unbeknownst to her, a poisonous snake was approaching her quietly while she was in thought. Shayol shrank back in fear when she noticed it, but the noise drew the attention of everyone in the temple. When she looked closer, that snake had disappeared completely, but before she could process her bewilderment, she witnessed an even more alarming scene. The followers in the temple had all turned around simultaneously when they heard the disturbance. Shayol, who had only seen the figures from the back until now, finally saw the faces of two of the followers, the sorcerer and Zhang San. At the next corner, Shayol stopped abruptly and took off the Hong sword on her back. The layout of the passageway that took her less than half an incense stick's time to sneak through earlier had somehow morphed into a labyrinth of winding passageways and identical rooms, trapping Shayol within. The night fog rose and filled the air. Her pursuers closed in from behind, swinging the swords in their hands. Shayol twisted her body to the side and raised a sheathed sword on her back to absorb the attack before turning her hand, skillfully disarming her foe. Holding the hilt of her sword between two fingers, she swung the blade forward, sending a gleaming arc like a crescent moon to her foe and forcing him to roll backward, barely avoiding the attack. Despite the successful counterattack, Shayol had no intention of dispatching him. Instead, she spun the blade around and stabbed behind her. The sound of metal breaking through armor and cutting through skin rang in her ears. The ambusher had no choice but to retreat, clutching his injured side. In the blink of an eye, two formidable cult members had suffered damage from Shayol. They were on their guard now and wary to launch another attack, but they kept Shayol trapped in the narrow passageway between them. With a flick of her wrist, Shayol turned the sword back around, blood splattering onto the wooden floor. She coldly assessed the two cultists bearing the faces of Zhangsan and the sorcerer. There was hesitation in her movements, which was unsurprising as she had been there for the preliminary and secondary examination of their corpses after all. She also witnessed their bodies rotting in the mortuary with her own eyes. However, after the short exchange, she was confident it was a disguise or an illusion. These two cultists were at least living individuals who bled when injured, and as living beings, they could be defeated and apprehended. Despite being dressed like cultivators, their actions followed none of their precepts. They were striking to kill, and Shayol dared not underestimate them. The two cultists learned their lesson after the first attempt. Exchanging glances, they launched a simultaneous attack with their dual blades and staff. Shayol stood firm. A faint green aura enveloped the tip of her sword, pointing straight to the ground. Things happened quickly. When the deadly attack struck, neither Zhangsan nor the sorcerer saw what happened. They just felt their weapons hitting their target. The cold glint of a blade flashed before Zhangsan's eyes, and a single-edged blade stabbed out from behind his ear, intercepting the horizontal slash of the sorcerer, the only thing preventing his head from rolling at this moment. Meanwhile, his partner, the sorcerer, fell under his own staff. Everything had happened so fast that when Zhangsan was been kicked to the ground, dislocating his chin in the impact, and got his limbs tied up, he was still unable to make out what had happened. It was just a split second. When did Shayol get behind him, and when did she swing her sword? After tying up the two of them, Shayol turned around and walked toward the temple without wasting time thinking. She had already alerted the enemy. By the time Tangzi arrived with backup from the bureau, the building would have been emptied. Though she had no idea what the enemy had in store for her, she knew that she could not back down. The further she went, the stronger the smell of incense became, and the thicker the smokescreen grew. The bright light ahead was the temple, its doors wide open. "You're here." A woman's voice came from inside the room. Her voice echoing in the spacious room made it sound almost ethereal. "The seeds that give birth to all have already begun to sprout." Shayol tightened her grip around the hilt of her sword and cautiously approached the temple. "A month ago, a sorcerer hurt others to amass wealth in the name of exorcism. He's a very naughty and dishonest boy." The woman's voice sounded very young, seemingly in her 20s, but her tone was more like a mother speaking of her children. "On the 7th day of the 7th lunar month of this year, a woman named Lin died in Xinsheng. The cause of death? Suicide." Shayol carefully stepped into the thick fog of the temple while conversing with the voice, attempting to pinpoint her exact location within the smoke. During the autopsy, her flesh was found rotting to the bones, which were dark in color, indicating that she was poisoned before death. I remember Lynn. Her smile was beautiful, like a fairy in a painting. That's why I chose her so that we could become immortals together. Shayol had now reached the core of the thick fog. The woman speaking was right in front of her. Just another step and she could capture the mastermind. Shayol! The door to the west of the temple was kicked open, and wind poured into the temple. In an instant, the sound of unsheathing swords echoed. The man who kicked down the door rushed inside and shouted anxiously, "Shayol, are you all right?" As if being woken from a dream, Tangzi's voice and the wind dispelled the fog in Shayol's eyes. When she saw what was in front of her, she broke into a cold sweat. Before her was a large incense burner, and she had nearly fallen into it. And the womanly figure she seemed to see was merely a statue next to the burner. The two men tied up by Tangzi's feet no longer bore the faces of Zhangsan and the sorcerer. She looked around, but there was nobody else in the room other than the Golden Keepers. End of Chapter 3.